Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest housing coalition. NHC is a diverse continuum of affordable housing stakeholders that convene and collaborate through dialogue, advocacy, research, and education to develop equitable solutions that serve our shared vision of an America where everyone is able to live in a quality, affordable home in a thriving community. I'm joined today by NHC's Board Chair, Ali Solis, and Vice Chair, Ralph Perrey, to discuss NHC's policy priorities and what the election could mean for housing during the lame duck session in November and December, and of course in 2025 and beyond. Ali is a veteran of housing issues in Washington, D.C., having held important leadership roles at Enterprise Community Partners, NeighborWorks America, and Make Room. In addition to serving as chair of our Board of Governors, she also serves on the board of Eden Housing and is chairwoman of the board for Up for Growth. She's currently a principal at S3 Solis Strategic Solutions. Ralph Perrey is the executive director of the Tennessee Housing Development Authority, appointed in November 2012 following 9 years of service on THDA's board of directors. He now is the longest-serving executive director in the agency's history. Ralph is also the immediate past chair of the board of the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Ralph and I worked together at Fannie Mae and on the Hill, where our members' offices were across the hall from each other. Welcome, Ali and Ralph. Let's get started.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.
We've all been working in housing for a long time. We have spent many years, decades even, struggling to get people to really pay attention to what we need to be doing to support affordable housing for this country. And all of a sudden, after decades of work, we are an overnight success. Everybody's talking about housing. I certainly never thought that I would see a 60-second spot from a presidential candidate that exclusively talked about housing. Everybody is talking about it, both parties, both presidential candidates. There's a reason for that, which is that there are a lot of people out there who are really struggling to afford a simple place to live, whether it's an apartment that they can afford or a home that they can buy, and particularly one that doesn't require them to sit in their car for 40 or 50 or 60 minutes or as long as an hour and a half or 2 hours, I've heard. So this is something that we've often thought about in terms of what's happening on the coast. I'm seeing statistics in Tennessee, in Omaha, Nebraska, in Boise, Idaho. I mean, this thing is happening everywhere. And so we have to focus on what the solutions are, and we have to get past some of these political roadblocks that have made it so hard to get pretty much anything done. I just want to get your sense of how you see where we're at today and kind of a big picture of what do we need to be focused on to actually solve this problem. Ali, why don't we start with you?
Sure, I'll kick us off. Yeah, I was going to say it's the trifecta. We had the State of the Union, the presidential debate, and the vice presidential debate with a significant focus on housing and the emerging crisis that we're really facing here. And, I was chuckling, but, if only the solution were that easy, right? We have been at this for a long time. And I think one of the things that really excites me about being involved with the National Housing Conference is it really does take all of us working together towards solving it. The magnitude of this problem is so big that not one organization or one, part of this housing industry can solve it alone. On the other hand, we know how to solve big problems. We are a country that's been able to do that when we have the political will and, issues like this one, which is strongly bipartisan. We have the ability to get things done. And so I think we know some about what works, and I think we need to lean into new technology and innovations and rethink perhaps the way our current system is building housing in this country, because to get to the numbers, and I know we're going to get into that, David, but, we're talking about the need for millions of homes. And it's impacting, extremely low income people and working class people all the same at different levels with different impacts. And so we need to create solutions that meet families where they are at different stages of their lives. And they need to be able to have choices and to be able to live and thrive in communities, as you suggest. And to do that, we need to be working at all levels of government and with the private sector. This is something that really does call for a public-private sector solution.
I really think we have a window of opportunity because it isn't often that housing is on almost everyone's mind. This is true in red states and blue. Housing affordability and availability are an issue almost everywhere. So I think we have a window of opportunity in the coming year, regardless who ends up in which positions. This is something that resonates with everybody's constituents, and we have an opportunity, and I think it's a short period of time, really, before everybody's attention span moves to other places.
Yeah, and housing has a really bad habit of being on everyone's top 5 list when 3 things get done, and we end up with a participant ribbon. We got quite a collection of participant ribbons in the closet, and we need some victories. So let's talk about housing production, because you guys mentioned supply is a big issue, millions of units behind, and law of supply and demand is never repealed. What do we need to do to build all these units? We've had people talk about it. The vice president has talked about it. We've heard Donald Trump talk about it. What are we going to do?
Yeah, I think it calls for both the supply and demand solution, but focusing on the supply side, David, I think we've got some tools that we know work. Programs like the low-income housing tax credit. Ralph administers through his state housing agency, but does so with private investment capital, right? That's how we build the largest number of affordable apartments in this country. And, there's bipartisan legislation that has been supported through a number of Congresses and, frankly, a number of administrations. We just need to get that done, right? And new ideas like the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act and some other tax incentive programs are close to getting to the finish line. And we don't need to debate those or discuss those. They've been hearings. They have had multiple opportunities for folks to weigh in. We simply need a Congress that comes back and a president that signs it into law as one simple starting point. Let's start with the things that we know work.
The market, at least in my state, the market is doing a great job meeting the demand for higher end, larger homes, higher end apartments. Nothing affordable gets built anywhere in the country without some sort of incentive, support, subsidy of the kind provided by housing tax credits, tax-exempt bonds, the various grants at the federal and state level that we can do. So we need more of those kinds of subsidies, why it's important to pass the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. And neighborhood homes is another one that Ali mentioned that I think has some potential there. But for those resources to really be put to work, we've got to work on, with all of our friends and partners across the country, on what I call getting the talk right. Because too often when people hear affordable, they're picturing something that they do not want anywhere near them. So we've got to do a better job of talking about what we're building, what it looks like, how it's going to fit into the neighborhood, and who it's for. Regular working folks that we need for our communities to just basically function. And I think if we get the talk right, we knock down some of the reflexive opposition to the zoning changes and other regulatory reforms that would be needed to make it easier to build workforce-targeted housing.
Yeah, I think that's huge. And when we talk about affordable housing, the people we're talking about are all the people we work with and live near and talk to every day and take care of our kids and our parents and make our meals. And it just gets lost in the conversation. The other thing is, one of the things we talk about a lot is zoning and YIMBY and NIMBY, and people don't want affordable housing in their backyard. But the people at these zoning hearings who are not in the room, who really need to be, are the employers, because they are really struggling hiring. And we have a great job market right now. And if you want to hire people, you got to have a place for them to live. Those are the folks who aren't in the room. I was at the Nevada Chamber of Commerce last month talking about this. And, I said, you guys need to be in the room. You're the absent power broker here. And there was a lot of nodding heads because they're dealing with this.
Yeah. One thing I've talked about in Tennessee audiences is, you have to have public hearings and that kind of thing, but don't make that your only source of input, because in my experience from my misspent youth politics, happy people don't go to public hearings.
There you have it.
You're going to get the naysayers. at those sessions. Have other ways to engage and connect with the people they hear about this while they're watching the evening news and they're in their easy chair going, yeah, it sounds like a good idea. But you need to engage them to do something more than just sit there and nod so that you get a truer sense of how your community feels about these things.
You talked about large employers, David, too. I think that's an important aspect of who we need to be engaging in these conversations. I look at the Commerce Department in this last administration put forward a program called the CHIPS program, where it was really about attracting industry to come into new communities. And what they did was they said, we're going to give you a lot of tax incentives to come build your manufacturing plants in our states and our cities. As a requirement, you're going to have to tell us how you're going to build affordable homes for your workforce and for those communities. And so, thinking not only that this is a problem for one agency to solve, but how do we look across incentives for employers? Because talk to any organizations that are large employers are facing one of the challenges their employees are facing are the issue of being able to find a place to live near where they have to work. And so, to your point, this isn't just a coastal community issue. And so in those middle income areas, I know Ralph can speak to this, rural communities as well. We need to be bringing all of those stakeholders to the table to talk about how we solve this together.
Ford's building a $5 billion electric car and battery facility outside of Brownsville, Tennessee. Brownsville's a town of 9,000 people. Rural West Tennessee's been losing population for 40 years. All of a sudden, all of those communities are going, we're going to have a lot of people. We need to build some housing, and there aren't ready resources. And even when there are, you got, where's the water sewer capability for this stuff, for one thing? And, all of these things come into it. Unless you want all of those workers and all the related jobs to be 40 miles down the road, closer to Memphis or Jackson, you've got to have a plan to also develop some of that housing, and we're working on some of that.
Tell me a little bit about some of the impediments to construction, because it's not just about the subsidy dollars. We do have subsidy dollars. We need more of them, but there's a lot of things that contribute to that gap. When you're on the front line, Ralph, I mean, when you're working with developers who are building in Tennessee, what are they facing?
Well, a lot of it is, it's related to zoning, what you're allowed to build where, but it can also be a variety, many layers of well-intentioned regulations, but when they're layered together, if you need a certain setback from the street, well, okay, but that adds a cost, reduces the amount of buildable space you have. It's well and good to say if you're going to build an apartment, you have to have a certain amount of parking. But when you apply that parking requirement to a building that's basically going to house homeless veterans who don't have cars, you've just added $500,000 to the cost of that project, which just happened to be the amount of the grant that we gave them to help that along. Some of the fire code things, if you build a tall, skinny, it's a single family. If you do a duplex, you got to have sprinklers everywhere. Just a lot of things. If you have to have a certain number of trees, maybe you can't build as many units and your costs get spread over 4 units instead of 5. There are a lot of little things like that. And I don't know that it's an easy conversation to convince people that maybe not all of these need to apply in every circumstance, and who breaks that tie. But just in general, having communities open to allowing the development of a wider variety of housing styles, all that missing middle stuff. There's a lot you can build between big apartments and big single family homes. Zoning in many places doesn't permit you to do garden court apartments or ADUs, townhomes and duplexes. And, that's going to be part of the solution. But there you get back to getting the talk right with the neighbors and with the community.
So, in addition to zoning, David, I would just say also some incentives. How do we accelerate some of the processes for getting approvals on development? If you've got a developer who's got a long track record working and being able to develop a good product, can we fast stream some of these approvals so they don't take so long? How do we work with city, local, and county, governments to help facilitate some of those approvals? We look at some of the programs like the Pro Housing program that recently was stood up at HUD. It is incentivizing local governments. It gives you grants if you're a local government and you've identified some ways that you can break down some of those barriers that Ralph talks about. It helps lift up examples because, by the way, some communities are doing these things. they're having to do that. We just need to make it easier for those communities, smaller communities that maybe don't have the same capacity to be able to sort of see what a jurisdiction that looks like them has already been able to do and copy and replace that. And then I also think we need to look at, you mentioned the housing stock that we have. Have we looked at intergenerational housing? Is there a different way to repurpose? We've got hopefully interest rates going down, but we also have to be thinking about people are living longer, right? We also have an aging population, many of which are, like my parents who are still living in the home that they can't afford to actually go to these nicer assisted living facilities, but they've got a 5-bedroom house that they don't need. So how do we think about repurposing some of the existing stock? The other thing that I just want to point out, in addition to expanding the supply of homes, we can't lose what we have. We have a major precipice of preservation. That's also a big issue that we have to think about. So it's a both and. Preserve what we have while massively expanding, to get to the gaps that we have in this country.
We need to fill this bucket, but there is a hole in it. Tell me a little bit about the preservation issue, because we are losing affordable housing at the same time we're trying to build it.
I mean, it's a multifaceted, as most of these issues are. I think for traditionally affordable homes that have either reached their tenure in terms of affordability, they're coming up on their caps. What incentives do we have for those owners to maintain them as affordable? And you add to that increased insurance premiums and all these other costs. This is happening, by the way, to not just, corporate investors and owners of these properties. This is hitting the nonprofit community. As mission-based organizations, I serve on the board of Eden Housing. We talk about this on a regular basis, about the challenges with the increase in cost to just maintain the property. Some people are having to sell off their assets in order to maintain the ones that they have. So how do we find a way to incentivize and certainly preserve those units longer hold? How do we build more sustainably so that preservation becomes easier? I think there's a number of things to look at as we think about preservation strategies. And by the way, it's not as sexy of a soundbite when we have the urgency to build and build more, but we cannot forget the importance of preserving what we have.
Well, and Ralph, you all just experienced 2 pretty horrific hurricanes and enormous flooding in areas that never get it. We've lost a lot of housing as a result of that. Tell me a little bit about what you're seeing in your communities and what people are experiencing right now and how we're going to help them, because there's an awful lot to do. And these natural disasters keep occurring closer and closer together, and we can't just keep doing the same thing over and over.
Unfortunately, what nature can take away in a matter of hours sometimes takes years to put right again. What we're hearing, we're still waiting for more comprehensive information from East Tennessee, but what we're hearing is most of the people impacted wouldn't have flood insurance. They live up in the mountains. It just wasn't a thought for folks. The amount of federal disaster money that they may get isn't going to be enough to rebuild. If the federal government is reworking its consideration of a flood zone, you might not be able to rebuild where you have been. We've encountered that in some other communities where it sets everything back. Now you got to find another site to rebuild that apartment complex or even that single family home. So in the short term, it's going to be, do you have a house that's still habitable? If not, where are you going? There'll probably be some makeshift FEMA trailer type things, but nobody wants those around for 6 years. How do you fund rebuilding if insurance isn't going to really be there? Your federal disaster payment may not be enough to cover it. Trying to see what assistance is going to come in, what additional resources the state may give us to do that, and how we might use our own resources to fill some gaps to really meet the most urgent need. But it's an area that is going to be, it's just going to take time to rebuild.
And, this, to your point, David, this is not just a sort of an anomaly of a year. These issues are going to continue. And by the way, our current system of funding these disasters is through these appropriations. What do we have now? Well, Congress is out. So we've got a 2-month period that we have to wait. Sadly, these things do take long, but we need to come up with a better solution to long-term disaster resiliency and sustainability planning and fund these for the long term, give these agencies some flexibility so that they can prepare more rapidly for what we know. The science and the data tells us that these are going to happen more often.
And it just takes so long. I have a bias for action, so I get a little antsy of this, but telling somebody, well, in a couple of years, we'll be able to help you rebuild your home. I mean,
I was on the ground when we did this for Katrina and Rita back in the Gulf Coast and New Orleans. It took 10 full years and we still weren't done, So
yeah.
Obviously we have some time and some experience. So hopefully we're doing things, we're building smarter and more sustainable. But to your point, Ralph, this is a great example that you gave about, these weren't flood zones, areas that we know are going to flood, right? And so disasters are happening in Texas, all different kinds of things. And we just need to be better prepared for them.
Well, and there's a lot less, I think, resistance we're going to see to helping those other people when people realize that actually I could be the next one very easily. When you have Asheville, North Carolina at 2,200 feet, just devastated. We're not talking about New Orleans anymore at -2 feet above sea level. It could happen anywhere. And it is happening everywhere, whether it's flooding or tornadoes or wildfires. We're really seeing this spread around, and I'm hoping that's going to result in a easier conversation about how we help each other.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think about our post-COVID environment and what we learned from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program. Here, too, a critically important program. We have a lot that we've learned from that. One of the things that we learned, frankly, is that the moratoriums on evictions, which seemed like a good idea at the time, we're seeing the impacts of history where the eviction moratoriums perhaps went on for too long. And so people got comfortable not paying their rent. We need to think about long-term. I know we're talking about supply here, but on the demand side, what do we do to help people that are working 1, 2, 3 jobs and they still don't make enough to meet the delta on their rents? We need some kind of demand solution here. Universal voucher, call it whatever you will, but some kind of assistance. What can we learn from the Emergency Rental Assistance Program so we do it better next time? How do we build relationships with these owners of these properties so that we can get more people into homes through the existing? I think it's the 40th anniversary of the Housing Choice Voucher Program, right? Here's a program that works. It needs improvement like most of them do. It needs more funding. But, how do we learn from some of these programs and experiences that have been around for a long time so that we can become more efficient and effective at solving these needs that people have?
Yes, it just gets more complicated. Vouchers are a good tool, but in my agency, we probably got 500 or 600 people walking around with vouchers that they cannot find a place to use. You can give me another 2,000 or 3,000 vouchers. That doesn't address that end of the equation.
And why is that?
Well, look at this economy. If I've got an apartment and I can put it up for rent this afternoon and I've got 14 people ready to pay whatever I'm asking, why am I signing up for a federal program, going through inspections, going through all of that work when I don't need to? Now, if I'm having trouble renting that apartment, then I'm happy to sign up for a program and putting up with a few things to get a renter in there and get some income coming in. But that's not the reality in most places of the country. There isn't enough supply. We're actually trying to be more aggressive in project basing some of our vouchers so that we can at least guarantee that there are places that a voucher eligible family can find housing. I don't know that there's an easy answer to that. Some places, I think, are looking to require landlords to accept a voucher, not discriminate against people who have vouchers. That's, I think, an easier political sell in some states than others.
Well, and I think we are seeing some examples that could be perhaps duplicated. So there are some investor owners that are looking at this and seeing it actually as an opportunity for continued revenue streams. And so organizations, I represent a group called Pretium, and they are actually working on creating an affordable fund where they can take more of these vouchers, partner with housing authorities, and help families who might not be able to live in a single family home in a desirable community, but for this partnership that they've created with the housing authority to take a voucher and provide this kind of an opportunity. And I think we need innovation that's happening, right? Whether it's in the voucher space, whether it's in the material development space of housing, the kinds of homes we're building. You hear about this in the tech world all the time. They have these, mini hubs when there's a crisis. We need something like that that's going to get us really focused on getting to supply more quickly and addressing some of these demand challenges for sure.
Well, and that's a great segue to one of the things that I wanted to talk about, which is the institutional investors. And I think it's been a big issue. It's been an issue for a long time in some very different ways. Back when I was the Treasury Department after the financial crisis, we were desperate to get institutional investors to buy these properties because they were literally rotting in place. And we needed them to be in there populating these homes and stabilizing neighborhoods. Now, we thought they were just going to sell into a rising market to first-time home buyers and others. And that didn't happen because they actually ended up finding out that this wasn't as bad a business as some of us thought. And now they've been in it for a while and they've attracted a lot of attention, institutional investors in particular. And one of the things that I always find amazing is that when you look at Ohio, which is the ultimate, I would consider it a reddish purple state, and you've got the chair of the Senate Banking and Housing Committee, who is Sherrod Brown. He's up for re-election, razor thin margins. His counterpart in the Senate, J.D. Vance, right? The vice presidential candidate for former President Trump. And one of the things they agree on the most is they hate institutional investors. And when you listen to them, I would challenge most people to pick out the last 5 times they've talked about this issue. And, we could play a game, Who Said It? And you would have a really hard time with that. And so very easy to be a populist on, but a lot more complicated.
I'll remind us we're in an election year, right? And so it's an easy narrative to have a villain in. And, by the way, the data, and this is where, data sometimes doesn't always win the day here, but the data in terms of the ownership of, the amount of homes that institutional investors really own in this country is less than 3%, right? So, but they've been painted, rightly so, as an easy target,
Oh, you're going to get all facty on me now, are you?
I'm just saying facts do matter, right? So, by the way, the narrative around corporate investors and these terms that get used, the Urban Institute has done a lot of studies about this. The majority of homes that are owned by investors are, smaller investors, not the large scale, what we call professionally managed investors. And by the way, there are bad actors. There's bad actors in every aspect of our industry, but I think we can easily get sidetracked on this sort of notion of pointing to a villain as opposed to focusing on the solutions. And one of the reasons that Treasury, you were there, David, went to these institutions to ask them for help was because there is some, real effort they bring in terms of scale and capital. And one of the things that they do really well is know how to rehab these homes and get them back into productive use. And so instead of focusing on this narrative that is, sort of the villain versus the right versus the wrong, how about we harness that power and figure out how we can create some incentives to do more affordable housing, to get more to scale. And I think there's some real interesting and innovative models that are out there. And, they're working in communities. NHC's board, one of our, John O'Callaghan spoke about this recently. He's with ANDP in Atlanta. He's partnering with some of these institutions, with Pretium in particular in Atlanta that I'm familiar with. And, they are, providing access to the homes when they're ready to sell them. And then John is able to make sure that they get into the hands of a low-income family or a working class family that, is looking for a long-term rental opportunity in a single family home. So there are partnerships that I think are worth further exploring. And frankly, I think harnessing what works about these industries and figuring out how we can create some incentives, just like we did with the low-income housing tax credit. When it was first created, that program, I'll remind us, right, had a different kind of institutional base. So when we talk about institutional investors, let's look at those that have been sort of critical partners in addressing some of our shortages in the past. And so I would argue that I think we need to look at SFR. And by the way, the other thing that data tells us is that a lot of these, there's no more homes, not a lot of homes to buy. So many of these companies are looking to build to rent. And again, as I started my comments, making sure that we have stock that's available for every family at different stages of their lives, I think there is a really important role for us to look at in the build to rent space, in the single family rental space, as well as providing these options perhaps along the way. I know we've talked about sort of, lease purchase. What are the tools that we don't have in the toolbox that could be, helping those that want to be homeowners, put them on a pathway to homeownership? So lots to explore in this space. The tired old narrative around villain versus warrior in this case, I think data tells us something different. On the other hand, we also have to make sure that we are working with good actors in communities and lifting up those models that are really working.
Yeah, I think where the bad rap on investors comes from folks who have done it poorly, targeting in particular low-income neighborhoods, not really making much of an effort to improve the property, maybe raising the rents over what they were there and being pretty quick on the trigger with evictions and such. That tends to poison the well for that. I think there have also been some places where well-established single-family neighborhoods of homeowners are greatly alarmed when someone comes in and starts buying up homes in the on the block where they're going to rent, and who's going in there and who's taking care of the property, and are you doing that as a homeowner would? But those are, I think, a minority of what's really being done out there. There will be people who would like to buy a home but can't. So they're looking for a place to rent. They would rather rent a single family home than be in an apartment. And I don't see anything wrong with the market trying to respond to that. I think they will get less political pushback doing some of this build to rent subdivisions, as opposed to trying to cherry pick some homes in well-established homeowner neighborhoods, gendering that kind of reflexive opposition. But in any industry, you'll have good actors and bad. Unfortunately, man bites dog is what's going to get the news, and it's the bad actors that you'll see highlighted on the 5 o'clock news.
Ralph, I think this is a really bad time to talk about man biting dog.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, when we talk about this issue, one of the things I think is easy to forget is that when Matthew Desmond came out with his book Evicted, and people really looked at that as some hard data on really the bleeding edge of the single family rental issue, these were all mom and pops. And all of these landlords were mom and pops, and a lot of them weren't doing much better than their tenants. And so that is actually the majority of the market. When some of these institutional investors come in, they take these properties off of their hands. They have the resources and scale to improve how they're being managed and how they're being repaired. I know Pretium is using AI to help make sure that when they send trucks out in the morning, that they're properly stocked so they can get to more homes. I mean, there's some real efforts going on here. We have to also recognize that on to rent, I mean, my number is always more when it comes to construction, and I don't care whether those units are side by side or stacked on top of each other. I mean, we just need more. And that's, I think, one of the most encouraging changes that I'm seeing in the institutional investor market is this focus on to rent. When they build new homes, they actually are finding that their maintenance costs are a lot lower. Their demand is going to be very high. And so it's a great investment. And we're also seeing, as we saw with John in Atlanta, some of these institutional investors are realizing that they can sell to the MLS for homes that are ideal for first-time home buyers and don't have to be the cash on the ground that's coming in and swooping those up. The market changes and morphs over time. And I think we're in the midst of seeing that, in part because of interest rates, right? I mean, we're not talking about 2% interest rates anymore, 3%.
Yeah, we won't be for a while.
I don't want to see an economic crisis that requires us to get down to 3% again. I'd be very happy to see us in the 4 to 5 range, and for that to be the new normal. I'm not real thrilled with 6.5. We'll see where this goes. I think it's heading in the right direction.
Great.
So let's talk about one of the items that I think in the vice president's housing agenda has gotten a lot of focus is down payment assistance. And down payment assistance is really important component of helping people become first-time home buyers. I think that one of the issues that it's become wrapped into is housing inflation. And well, if you give all these people down payment assistance, you're going to have more demand and then higher prices. And I mean, if you gave everybody down payment assistance, I'm sure that would be the case. But when you target it to people who really need it, and you do it in a way where it makes a difference, and especially when you pair it with counseling, you can make a big difference, and you're not going to see inflation in housing prices. So what do you guys experience when it comes to that? And, Ralph, I can start with you because you have some programs there in Tennessee, right?
We provide a generous amount of down payment assistance. We'll help you with 5% of the purchase price. The drag is lack of inventory for our borrowers to buy. That's why our origination numbers look pretty good in dollar terms, but we're doing 2,000 fewer loans a year than we were back in 2019. Adding a lot more DPA without also putting a lot of emphasis on building housing for those folks to buy, that will be inflationary. If 20 people want to buy the home, the price goes up more than if just 2 people do. I worry about addressing the down payment side of it because it will encourage more people to look. And if you're not doing anything to have more homes that are affordable for them, you're not really helping very much. It's like passing out extra vouchers when no landlords are taking vouchers. It gives you a nice warm feeling, but you're really not moving that. But having said that, I think we found when we made a specific effort around minority home ownership in Memphis that when we had some targeted additional down payment resources, it did bring more people into the market and made it possible for more people to buy that first home. But you have to have the supply. You have to have the homes that people want to buy and are able to buy.
And that's the foundation of this issue. I mean, everything we talk about, we always end up circling right back to supply. And it's not an or, it's an and. We have to do, and we're perfectly capable of walking and chewing gum at the same time, but we often don't. And so, I think that any one solution, you're trying to make a magic wand, is just not going to work. And supply. I mean, that's just the foundation of everything we're dealing with.
The other thing that comes to mind for me, Ralph, down payment is great if you're in a position to be ready to buy. But there's a lot of families who may need some support on credit improvements, getting more on a financial stable track so that if they want to become homeowners, they could, but maybe they want to invest in a small business, that they should be allowed to do that as well. But that requires financial education, literacy, and support systems. So there's some simple things that now are becoming more standard within our industry. Positive rent reporting, for example, that helps people build their credit, improve their credit, no longer having to rent their furniture, right, at exorbitant rates, or not having to go to cash in their checks at a high interest rate. So all of these steps, which are meant to help really promote financial stability and independence for families, are all the right pathway. And we need a bunch of these tools, of which down payment is one, but not the only one, and all of which have to be amplified with supply of homes to meet these families at every stage of their life. My 86-year-old mother doesn't need a down payment assistance, but she sure needs, a place to go so that she can free up this 5-bedroom home that she doesn't need any longer. And so where's the disconnect there that how do we start to fill in some of those holes as well?
I would strongly echo what you said about counseling and financial literacy. We financially support a pretty good network of counselors, and we require counseling for anybody who's going to apply for a THDA mortgage. That certificate's good for a year. But, it not only demystifies the process, takes some of the anxiety out of it, but it helps people figure out how to handle their money and manage their credit so that they will more easily qualify. But also, once they become homeowners, they have a better sense for how they have to manage things so that they succeed in home ownership. Because we're the loan servicer on our own loans, we have a lot of opportunities to continue sharing information and intervening early if folks are running into some problems. It's sort of a continuing for us. I'm happy when we put someone into a home. Our real success is that they succeed in home ownership, as it's the building block for a lot of good things they want for themselves and their families.
So let's talk about the election. It's right up upon us, and we're going to be airing this, I think it may be on election day or the day before. We are looking at razor-thin margins. We could easily see both the House and the Senate flip and have party control change in both bodies. We're going to get a new president regardless of who wins the election, and it will be very different directions. And we may not know the answer to any of these questions on November 5th, or hopefully we'll know by December 5th. But we're going to have a lame duck session of Congress. I think that's clear. The Hurricane Milton and Helene have guaranteed that. There's a lot to do. So what do you guys see? I'm not going to ask you to handicap the election because I don't have a coin that I can flip in my pocket right now. I don't use a lot of change anymore. But what are we looking at in terms of the top priorities for a lame duck session, and then the first 100 days. And we'll start with President Trump and then President Harris in terms of their agendas, depending on which one of them actually gets that title and becomes number 47. But let's start with lame duck. Allie?
For me, nobody wants to become president and have to address leftover lingering issues. So my hope is that they'll take care of the appropriations process and get that done. On the housing side, there's strong support. I think they can get those things done, and they should finish up appropriations and not leave that to a new president to try to address. And obviously, we've got the issue of the disaster funding that needs to be finalized and addressed as well. My hope would be, frankly, that they would provide a long-term solution to this issue of disaster funding as part of that package. We'll see. You can't put too much on a Christmas tree for a lame duck, but at least those two things, get those things done so that the next administration comes in with somewhat of a fresh slate. And frankly, David, to your point, either of these candidates, I know you said to talk about Trump first, regardless of what happens, one thing that we know for certain is that we're going to have slim margins. Whoever is in the majority of either the House or Senate, and frankly, whoever's in the White House, this isn't going to be an easy issue when someone can come and jam down their agenda. It is going to require bipartisanship and support. And the good news for housers and people like us is that these are issues that have strong bipartisan support. The problem, of course, is that we can then get into our own ways, our own silos as housing organizations and start to advocate for our individual little pieces of the pie, as opposed to going in and talking about the macro problems we have to solve here, which are around housing supply and making sure that we've got enough subsidy for those families that are most in need. We didn't have much time to talk about this, but we've got a lot of families that are facing homelessness that weren't before. The definition of homelessness, and Ralph, I'm sure you can speak to this, is not the person underneath the bridge or only the person underneath the bridge. It's families who are living couch to couch and are looking to be, could be next month that they end up homeless. So how we define all of these massive issues as they relate to housing and provide opportunities to support families wherever they are along the spectrum is critically important. And I think the good news is we have a strong bipartisan support for a lot of these solutions, regardless of who wins. That means our work is going to be really important too. We have to get out there. We're going to have new members of Congress to educate. We're going to have to do that. People that don't understand the alphabet soup of all of our programs. To the extent that we can do that with one voice, which is why I love the National Housing Conference, the better we're going to be in a position to hit the ground running so that we can turn our attention to next year's tax measures and maybe get some new, bigger wins. I think it'll be an interesting time, and I certainly hope we don't squander that time by infighting among the housing organizations and really trying to speak with one voice about the macro level issues we have facing our nation.
Well, and that's where NHC has really made a difference, I think, helping find that highest common denominator of agreement, because we're not going to get what we don't agree on. We never have. And so let's talk about where we overlap and focus on that first. Then we can have our disagreements, which we should have, but let's get them in order, get the order right. Ralph?
A good thing to remember is that the perfect is the enemy of the good. Let's really take advantage of this window of opportunity that we have when there is bipartisan interest and support for housing and narrow it down to some things where there is broad agreement and try to get those done. I'm not terribly optimistic about the lame duck. I think some kind of disaster work will get passed. But the larger appropriation thing, I suspect that the team that loses on election day will be trying to pass some things that they don't think they can pass in January. And the team that wins will want to delay some of those big choices for when they take over. I'm not all that optimistic that the lame duck produces much other than some stopgap appropriation bills and some disaster relief. And looking into next year, I think we need to be realistic that the new administration will have a list of 17 things they've got to get done immediately, including some things that we don't have a lot. There's a deficit. There are all sorts of foreign policy challenges out there. Sometimes you end up responding to things that happen elsewhere, and you don't have much choice on that. So the best we can hope for is that we have a reasonably standard and peaceful transition, one way or the other, and that we have vehicles early in the year that can carry the key housing provisions that we need. That big tax bill next year is probably the best opportunity. But I think we're going to be calling an audible every day for about 6 months just to see what's going on.
Well, I think, we're in a situation right now where there's a lot of people in this country who believe if the other guys win, it's the end of democracy. It's the end of everything. We're going to have a dictatorship. And I know if you're a Democrat, you hear this every day and you think about it in the context of President Trump. It's all you see. But if you are a Republican and all you hear is news that's coming from the folks that you like to listen to, you're hearing the same thing, just with different names.
Mm-hmm.
And, we never want to admit that's a possibility on the other side, but we have an awfully resilient Constitution here. So if you set that aside and you walk into the Oval Office, on, say, February 1st, and the president's got those first 100 days, and Donald Trump is sitting behind the desk in the Oval Office, Ralph, what do you say? Knowing all these other priorities, what does he need to focus on right off the bat?
If he asked me, I'll say, Mr. President, the work that we do directly benefits a lot of the Americans who voted for you. The folks that Mr. Vance talks about in Middletown, Ohio, regular blue-collar working folks who are finding it difficult to find housing that they can afford. You address that. You address a lot of the other things that your voters are concerned about. And you can do that in a number of ways that are consistent with your philosophy of government, working through the state HFAs, for example. That would be my pitch, just reiterating that an awful lot of people who voted for President Trump are going to be beneficiaries of our concerted efforts to expand the supply and availability of housing that regular working people can afford.
Allie, you're standing in front of President Trump. What do you say?
I would say, Mr. President, we appreciate that you understand the importance of housing and the importance it plays to our economic recovery in this country. As a big proponent of small businesses and supporters of that work, they play a significant role in the development of homes. Because you understand the importance of a limited role for the federal government, we also need the private sector at that table. So I would encourage you to think about how you bring in the largest employers to help us solve this problem together. Use the power of your bully pulpit to think about private-public partnerships and new ways that we can get to scale more quickly. And use your relationships and abilities to sort of move markets to help us support this work. So I would really call upon his relationships in the private sector to figure out how we can get more innovation on the development and reduce some of those regulations, incentivize reductions of barriers without harming any of the safety and soundness of the housing that we know we need to build for people. But that's what I would focus on with President Trump.
So, Ralph, you walk into the Oval Office, and you got President Harris is now sitting behind the desk. You've said hi to her chief of staff, Liz Cheney. And what do you do? What's your first pitch to her on where she really needs to? She's got a big housing plan. She's not going to get it all done overnight. So where does she need to start?
I'd say, Madam President, we are all greatly encouraged by your specific interest and expressed interest in housing. I would encourage you first to focus on expanding the supply, maybe strengthening the incentives that President Biden offered to communities that are more open to zoning changes and regulatory reform to make it easier to build. A lot of what you want to do is around affordability begins with addressing the lack of supply. I would encourage that to be your first focus, and then later provide additional resources for the state HFAs for things like additional down payment assistance or more specifically targeted. But focus first on increasing the supply.
Allie, you're sitting down on one of those cool couches. She's on the other one. What do you have to say to her?
Well, Madam President, I align my comments with my esteemed colleague, Mr. Perry, and second those comments. And I would say to her, I really appreciate lifting up the care economy and the need we have. And those very workers that you talk about that are supporting and taking care of our seniors, my parents, my mother who has Alzheimer's, and those young daycare providers. My mom also ran a daycare from her home for 50 years. Those people need places to live. They need places to help support their small businesses, but also have affordable housing. And so when you think about solutions for the care economy that is such a critical platform, understand that housing is central to that. And think about incentives that allow us to both address a childcare problem that we have in this country, as well as a housing problem, and create some incentives for us to do more in those spaces. We've got an aging population that's living longer. Help us think about how we can expand the supply of homes so that we've got enough homes to meet the needs of families at every stage of their life.
I think that if it was me, I would say to both of them, you're running for something here. You're running for your legacy or you're running for re-election. And everybody knows if you're a first-term president, that starts on day one, whether we like it or not. And if you're a second-term president, your legacy is already looming large. And if you're going to get something done that's going to really last and mean something that people are going to remember, housing is going to be it. And you can have a huge impact. If you get that right, you're going to have a huge problem if you don't. So I think that's really important. And if you're going to do that, the only way you're going to do that is if you work across the aisle. And I think that's going to be a challenge, notwithstanding the rhetoric about the need to do it. It's absolutely harder to actually do than to talk about. But we have lost a lot of muscle memory in working together, and we're going to have to get that back. Mm-hmm. And that's going to make the difference. When we look at the two bills that I think all three of us have been talking about a lot, Neighborhood Homes Investment Act and Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, the thing that sets them apart, equal number of Republicans as Democrats have co-sponsored these bills. And in the case of AHCIA, half the Congress.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think we have opportunities. I think there's just going to be a lot of hard feelings after the election. One of our Tennessee's former governors once observed that there's a big difference between the issues you emphasize in the campaign and the issues you actually have to deal with when you get into office. I think you look at some of the what I might refer to as peripheral issues. Just it's the red meat for each side that's dominating the ads and a lot of the conversation. But there's some bigger things that really have to be dealt with by the next president and the next Congress. Hopefully they can get by the animosity of the campaign and make some progress for the country on some of those issues. Housing in particular.
I certainly hope by the time this airs, we have a president that's actually delivering a unifying message in this country and that's helping us find ways to bring people together. I think housing is one of those kinds of issues, and there are others, but that's what we need. We need a leader who's going to help us heal and move forward as a great nation that we are. And whoever wins, I think we have a place at the table to be part of that solution.
And I can't think of a better way to end this conversation. So thank you, Allie. Thank you, Ralph. It's always a pleasure to catch up with you and talk about these things. We could do it all day, but we'll leave the rest of that for another day. Looking forward to having you back in town when we can get something to eat and just dive right back into it.
It's a deal. Thank you, David. Thanks, Allie. Good to be with you.
Thank you all.
Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.